morning from Mission Control Houston here at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, and welcome to our live coverage of the departure of Orbital ATK Cygnus, getting ready to enter the final stages of its 8th commercial resupply mission to the International Space Station. You're looking now inside the room, overseeing systems on board the station, the Orbit 1 team manning consoles, looking at all of the different items as we get ready to release this cargo craft. Just real quick, inside the room, they're led today by Flight Director TJ Creamer. There on the right, and just above him is Kathy Bolt, the Capcom for this morning, who you will hear talking to the astronauts on board the station. And right now, 2 of those crew members are on board, and everybody's going to be working with these folks out at Dulles in the Orbital ATK launch control, and they'll be overseeing Cygnus during the final stages of its mission today. And Cygnus itself right now sits poised at the end of Canadarm2, the space station's robotic arm. The unmanned cargo craft is packed with over 6,200 pounds of trash and other items marked for disposal before it gets ready to leave in just a couple of minutes from now. Cygnus was unberthed yesterday and has been sitting at the end of this robotic arm for a little under a day now, a little under 24 hours, and very soon it will be released. Again, 2 crew members on board right now, Mark Vandehei and Joe Acaba, NASA astronauts, are standing by in the station's cupola, and they'll be giving the command. This is actually a view at what they're looking at, one of the monitors inside that cupola, looking right at the business end of the robotic arm still attached to Cygnus at the base there, and it'll be releasing it in just a couple of minutes as mentioned. That release window opens just about 10 minutes after sunrise, which has just begun on board the station. You can see things starting to light up, the sunlight just coming over the rim of the Earth as it shines once more on the International Space Station. That release window opens up at 6:56 a.m. Central Time, 7:56 a.m. Eastern. And then a number of steps take place before the actual release. They'll give the command, and a series of snares on the vehicle will begin to retract, and then Cygnus will be in free drift. They'll slowly back the arm away, which we'll be able to see from these camera views, and then Cygnus will execute a series of departure burns to exit the area around the International Space Station and begin its trip towards a destructive re-entry through the Earth's atmosphere. The planned release right now for Cygnus is 7:10 a.m. Central, 8:10 a.m. Eastern. That's roughly when they should give the command. It takes about a minute or so for that command to process and the snares to begin releasing Cygnus. But again, 7:10 a.m. Central, the target time for today. After the release, a departure burn will start just about a minute later and fire for just under 3 minutes. And then Cygnus will eventually make its way out of the designated checkpoints around the International Space Station. First, what's known as the Keep Out Sphere, and then the Approach Ellipsoid. And again, these are checkpoints that all visiting vehicles to the station pass through and govern a lot of the rules for traveling to and from the station for all visiting spacecraft. For Cygnus, though, today isn't the end. It'll have one more major science objective to complete before it re-enters through the Earth's atmosphere. It's going to be deploying 14 CubeSats. Now, these are small, roughly the size of a bread box, satellites that it'll deploy from an external deployer built and maintained by NanoRacks, one of the many commercial companies taking advantage of research opportunities on the International Space Station. It'll have 14 of these satellites that it'll look to release just about 6 hours following its departure.
Cygnus release review is complete.
Okay, we copy. So with that, you are go to check Cygnus configuration per step 1 and 1.602, Cygnus departure monitoring.
Yep, and you go for step 1 of 1.602.
And again, the voices hearing just now, Kathy Bolt down here in Mission Control, serving as the Capcom for Orbit 1. And on board the station, you're listening to Joe Acaba. He's inside the cupola along with fellow NASA astronaut Mark Vandehei, the 2 of them overseeing the release of Cygnus today. Again, they're marching through a series of steps, getting us ready for that release at about 7:10 a.m. Central Time. Here in Mission Control Houston, the teams were polled and everybody go for the planned release, along with the team out in Dulles, Virginia, the Orbital ATK flight controllers who are going to be overseeing Cygnus throughout its departure all the way through its deorbit, burn, and re-entry through the Earth's atmosphere, which is currently targeted for December 18th. But as mentioned, just about 6 hours or so after this departure, the CubeSats plan to be deployed, 14 of them, covering a range of different disciplines, among them 8 CubeSats known as Lemur 2s. These are part of an ongoing and growing constellation of small satellites that are being used to track ships across the Earth's oceans. Think of it as kind of air traffic control for ships over the oceans. So adding to their constellation, 2 satellites as well that were funded through NASA's Small Spacecraft Technology Program, which is looking to help develop and mature these technologies that will expand our capabilities for small spacecraft, inexpensive spacecraft, with a focus on communications, propulsion, power, and autonomous operations in low Earth orbit. So some major science still ahead for Cygnus, which delivered several thousand pounds of supplies to the International Space Station back when it arrived. The vehicle, which launched on November 12th, arrived on the 14th. So this is the 24th day of its mission, the 22nd day since arriving to the station.
We copy. Stand by for release.
And just there getting the call from Joe Acaba, the crew ready for the release. Again, we're just a little under 20 minutes away from the planned release of Cygnus. Everything looking good, not tracking any issues with the vehicle, with the robotic arm, or any of the systems required for monitoring the vehicle. So everything marching towards that on-time release and departure. As we were discussing, though, Cygnus arrived with about 7,400 pounds of cargo, supporting dozens of experiments and delivering a lot of crew supplies to the Expedition 53 crew.
1310 GMT, steps 2 through 4 and 1.320. And remember, the release window closes at 14:08.
Okay, copy. Go for release 1310.
Good copy.
You just heard Joe Acaba report go for release at 13:10. Just a reminder, the International Space Station running on Greenwich Mean Time GMT. That's the universal time that all of the different control centers around the globe supporting the International Space Station operate on, as well as the crew members themselves. It was necessary to pick one unifying time zone for everyone to work in. And these 2 crew members, Mark Vandehei there on the left, who's going to be the prime for this release, and Joe Acaba, who's backing him up and working all of the communication back with Mission Control right now, is going to be looking over his shoulder. And again, this a monitor inside that cupola where they're manning the robotics workstation, looking directly at Cygnus, just a few meters away from them, still attached to the end of the space station's robotic arm. Cygnus was actually unberthed a little earlier than normal during its missions. It was unberthed yesterday from the bottom of Node 1, also known as Unity. The vehicle was packed full of a record amount of items, actually over 6,200 pounds on board for disposal today. That's actually the heaviest Cygnus to date, in a little bit, 200 to 300 kilograms more than was originally planned. So the teams down here on the ground doing a great job of calculating everything that'll fit in, and the crew working several long hours to make sure Cygnus was packed and ready to go. Again, this is a replay from yesterday morning when Cygnus was unberthed from the bottom of Node 1, where it had been docked for 21 days. This early unberth was done for an actual engineering test. Cygnus was left attached to the robotic arm and eventually maneuvered up over the top of Node 2 Harmony, which is where future U.S. commercial crew vehicles being developed by Boeing and SpaceX are targeted to dock once they begin launching humans from the Space Coast in Florida again in the not-too-distant future. Cygnus was positioned there as an engineering test to look at potential impacts of the GPS capabilities on board station. It was held in place over the space-facing port on Node 2, where a future international docking adapter will reside and allow, it'll be one of the 2 ports on Node 2 where it'll be these commercial crew vehicles will be able to dock. Cygnus was held in place there, as there are some concerns about blocking the GPS positioning, or actually the angles from which these GPS receivers can get signals from GPS satellites, which these approaching spacecraft are going to use. And so it was held in place to simulate a vehicle actually being docked to the top of Node 2 to see what kind of impacts. And then the teams collected GPS readings throughout several hours while Cygnus was just held in place. And all of that, again, just preparing us, just another engineering test, another step down the road towards getting ready to start welcoming crews on those commercial vehicles. Once that was complete, though, Cygnus, all of that done by robotics controllers down here on the ground. But once that test was complete overnight, Cygnus was maneuvered back under the station to where it now resides and has been waiting for a few hours, and everything continuing to march towards that on-time release, hopefully coming at 7:10 a.m. Central, 8:10 a.m. Eastern. And again, once that command is given, it takes about a minute or so for the command to process and the snares to begin to retract away from the vehicle. And then the arm will slowly release it. It'll give it a tiny little push, and you'll see Cygnus separate from the arm. And then Mark Van de Heij will work to retract the arm away from Cygnus. And then about 1 minute after release, Cygnus will execute a departure burn, firing thrusters for about 3 minutes to begin leaving the area around the International Space Station. It'll exit a keep-out sphere and then the approach ellipsoid, and then it'll be well on its way towards the rest of its missions. Cygnus is actually going to raise its orbit by about 450 kilometers in order to deploy these 14 CubeSats. It's going to do that over the course of about 6 hours. And then once those CubeSats are also released today, it'll begin setting itself up for that eventual entry back through the Earth's atmosphere, that destructive re-entry, doing a deorbit burn, and that entry coming up on December 18th. And just to clarify, Cygnus will raise its altitude to about 450 kilometers, operating right now at about 400 kilometers. So getting a good deal above the International Space Station for these releases, and then out several kilometers as well, just to ensure the CubeSats are themselves in a good orbit, not in any particular orbit around the International Space Station. But these 14 CubeSats contributing to a number of different scientific investigations, and then, as mentioned, the ship tracking capability directly impacting those of us living back down here on Earth. At this point, though, you can see the sun definitely shining on the planet below and on the International Space Station, which is about to make a swing up over the southern tip of South America. It's about to cross just over Chile and the southern part of Argentina, but right now still out over the Pacific Ocean, orbiting about 250 statute miles over the Earth's surface. These releases always planned during daylight hours, so the teams have a good visual of Cygnus as it's released from the robotic arm. And again, at this point, the release window is open. If they hit any snags with the robotic arm, the release window actually stays open for a little over an hour. It'll close at 8:08 a.m. Central Time, 9:08 a.m. Eastern. So the teams have options, or they have room to work any potential issues if they should crop up. Then there's always a backup release window 1 orbit later. And right now we're just about 10 minutes away from the planned release of Cygnus. Again, this is Orbital ATK's 8th resupply mission to the International Space Station. The vehicle arrived back on November 14th after launching from the Wallops Flight Facility on an Orbital ATK Antares rocket on November 12th. The vehicle itself, which is at an elapsed time of just over 24 days, it actually just passed into the 24th day of its mission 41 minutes ago, is dubbed the SS Gene Cernan, named after NASA astronaut Eugene Andrew Cernan, who passed away a little bit earlier this year. Gene Cernan, the last person to walk on the moon, was the commander of Apollo 17, which was the final lunar landing, and one of only 3 humans to travel to the moon on 2 different occasions. So this vehicle named in his honor, and this vehicle which delivered several thousand pounds of supplies to the International Space Station, just one step closer to the end of a very successful mission. Underneath Cygnus there, you can see land coming into view, is stationed right now smack dab over the southern part of Argentina, about to cross back over open water. It's going to skirt along the eastern coast of South America as it swings up over the Atlantic Ocean, but getting some good views today as we are in that full daylight for this release. And as of right now, we're just a little over 7 minutes away from the planned departure of Cygnus. So we're about 7.5 minutes away from the release. Again, things will start to pick up in the next couple of minutes. You'll hear some chatter from Joe Acaba on board the International Space Station and Kathy Bolt down here in Mission Control Houston, as Acaba and Mark Vandehei inside the cupola are at the robotics workstation ready to give the command to release Cygnus. And we are now just 5 minutes and counting from the release of Cygnus. And Cygnus still grappled there by the Canadarm2 robotic arm. Again, it was grappled and then unberthed from the International Space Station yesterday morning on December 5th, and that was done in order to position Cygnus overnight for some engineering tests Looking at GPS capabilities for the station, if a vehicle were docked to the top of Node 2, where future commercial crew vehicles are planned to dock, looking at any impacts to the ability for the GPS in that area of the ship to function is that'll be vital for approaching vehicles, especially if a vehicle is docked to that portion of the station, so doing that engineering test and then maneuvering Cygnus back down underneath the station where it currently sits poised to release in just a couple of minutes. And again, still inside Joe Acaba and Mark Vande Hei, the prime for release today. Inside the cupola, the bay window area on the underside of the International Space Station with a very clear view of the vehicle itself, but also the robotics workstation. This is actually one of the monitors that they're looking at right now inside of that cupola workstation, and they'll be responsible for giving the command. All of the robotics up until this point controlled by folks down here on the ground in Mission Control Houston and also at the Robotics Center up in Canada. The Canadian Space Agency responsible for building, maintaining, designing, and troubleshooting everything with the robotic arm on board the station, and also for a lot of the controlling work. But once they give the command, it'll take a few moments for everything to process and the snares to begin to retract and then release Cygnus, and we'll see it slowly start to separate from the arm. The astronauts will then send commands to begin backing the arm slowly away, which we'll get a pretty good view of from right here. And then once that's been done, it'll be about a minute following the release, and then thrusters on Cygnus will begin to fire, and it'll execute what's known as a departure burn. So just a very gentle firing of these thrusters to begin flying away from the International Space Station, and then it'll begin exiting those predefined checkpoints, something known as the keep out sphere, and then the approach ellipsoid, and these are just areas around the International Space Station that help to govern what vehicles need to be doing, depending on how close they are to the station. Also governs when the flight control teams controlling the actual vehicles have some very defined steps for interacting with our teams here in Mission Control. And again, today, a joint effort between the teams here in Mission Control who checked all of their systems in our go for the release, and also the teams out in Dulles, Virginia with Orbital ATK who are going to be responsible for controlling Cygnus following its release and all the way up to that deorbit burn and re-entry through the Earth's atmosphere, that destructive re-entry, which is targeted for December 18th. And we are coming up, we're 1 minute, 15 seconds away from that planned release. We'll get a call from the crew members on board, and we'll be able to confirm with the robotics officer here in Houston once that release command has been given. And we are 1 minute and counting. And we're just a few seconds away, should be hearing the call of the release any moment now. The teams here in Mission Control seeing the trigger command has been given. And standing by for release. All the snares in motion. And with that, the snares are open. So Cygnus now released from the space station's robotic arm, that coming at 7:11 a.m. Central, 8:11 a.m. Eastern, while the station was just about 257 statute miles over or off the eastern coast of Brazil, flying over the South Atlantic Ocean. And you can see the arm now moving away from Cygnus. The crew members commanding the robotic arm to back away. You can see the docking target there on Cygnus, the grapple target, and the fixture to which the arm was attached coming fully into view there. And once the robotic arm's fully backed away and everything looks good, they'll begin that departure burn. Again, that release coming at 7:11 a.m. Central, 8:11 a.m. Eastern Time. The station flying about 257 statute miles off the east coast of Brazil over the South Atlantic Ocean. Getting a great view there of the bottom of Cygnus. You can see the service module, the two hexagonal solar arrays which provide power to the vehicle. The arm fully backed away now, standing by for that departure burn.
Houston Station, Cygnus aboard, commanded.
We copy and concur.
And you can see Cygnus now moving away. That departure burn has begun. Again, this is scheduled to last about 3 minutes.
Station on 2, the Cygnus departure burn is in progress. Continue to monitor departure steps 2 and 3 and 1.602.
And we copy.
So hearing from the visiting vehicle officer, everything looking good so far with Cygnus as it still flies away from the International Space Station. That release coming just about on time at 7:11 a.m. Central, 8:11 a.m. Eastern Time. Cygnus craft packed with over 6,200 pounds of items marked for disposal. now flying away from the International Space Station. Should be just about 30 seconds or so still left in this burn. And then the engines will shut off and Cygnus will continue flying away. Just a few seconds after that burn finishes, it should be outside of the keep out sphere, and we'll keep an eye on Cygnus and keep with our broadcast until it exits what's known as the approach ellipsoid, which takes about 20 minutes following that departure. And with that, the departure burn is complete. Everything's still looking great with Cygnus as it flies away from the International Space Station again on day 24 of its mission. The vehicle delivered over 7,400 pounds.
The arm is now safe, and I want to congratulate everybody involved in this outstanding Cygnus mission. That lots of people put lots of time, talent, and dedication into this, and it was a huge honor for all of us on the space station to be able to participate in it.
And we copy and concur, and we appreciate all the work that you guys did, both to unload it and then load it back up and send it home today. And Station on 2 will confirm that the departure burn is complete.
We copy, the burn complete.
Great job, guys.
So Cygnus now retreating into the distance as it continues to fly away from the International Space Station. The vehicle, dubbed the SS Gene Cernan, packed with a record amount of items for disposal. Again, this is the heaviest Cygnus ever to depart the International Space Station, with over 6,200 pounds on board. But not just stuff for disposal, also still carrying that external deployer and 14 CubeSats, which it's set to deploy after it raises its orbit a little bit later today. So the mission not over for Cygnus. Its time at the International Space Station is at a close, but still some important science to go, and then all of that ultimately culminating in a destructive re-entry coming up on December 18th. But we'll continue to watch Cygnus fly off into the black, keep with it as long as we can, and at least until it's out of that approach ellipsoid.
It is a 200-meter keep-out sphere.
Copy.
And in case you're wondering what's in your view, this is actually a camera on the very end of the robotic arm. So this is the view we had that was looking directly at the grapple fixture on Cygnus itself. But you're actually seeing the very end, the latching end effector, one of which was just recently replaced on 3 spacewalks back in October on the Canadarm2 robotic arm. That small dot in the middle getting smaller is the Cygnus spacecraft. It's left the keep out sphere, that's this imaginary 200-meter sphere around the International Space Station. that governs a lot of what spacecraft can and cannot do when flying to the International Space Station. It's going to continue to depart, eventually going out of the approach ellipsoid, and that takes about 20 minutes after the release, so that should be in about 10 or 11 minutes or so. And then Cygnus will be well on its way. The team at Orbital ATK Mission Control out at Dulles, now in control and monitoring Cygnus while it departs. They're going to be responsible for sending commands and flying the vehicle over the next several days, as again it's going to raise its orbit just after it finishes departing from the International Space Station to set up to deploy some CubeSats, some small satellites that it'll deploy from an external device on the vehicle in just a couple of hours from now. And then ultimately they'll set Cygnus up for that destructive re-entry targeted for December 18th. And while this is the end of this mission, Orbital ATK is still one of those suppliers for cargo with missions coming up in the future. If you want to follow all of their activities, you can do so on the various social media scenes you can see here on your screen, facebook.com/OrbitalATK and at Orbital ATK on Twitter and Orbital_ATK on Instagram. But right now, the vehicle mostly out of sight, but still flying away from the International Space Station. We'll wait until it's out of that approach ellipsoid just to confirm, and then we'll be done for today. Meanwhile, the station itself giving us a pretty great view of the northern part of Africa. Right now, it's actually just over the, just across the western coast. Right now, it's flying just over the center of Mali, and you're about to see a lot of the Saharan desert from these cameras as it continues to fly up and eventually moving out over the Mediterranean Sea. And some of the vibrant reds and browns of the Sahara Desert coming into view now as the station continues to fly over. Right now about 253 statute miles over the Earth's surface. Just about to cross the border between Mali and Algeria. Not in view, the Cygnus vehicle, which was released at 7:11 a.m. Central Time, 8:11 a.m. Eastern, still flying away. Just about 5 minutes or so should be out of that approach ellipsoid. The vehicle already out of sight from most of the cameras on board the International Space Station, which is why we don't have a view on it, and unfortunately no cameras on Cygnus itself, but the vehicle continuing to depart. And then after this departure is complete, it's going to begin raising its orbit, setting it up for those CubeSat deploys, 14 of which are going to be fired out from an external deployer on the vehicle, built and managed by NanoRacks, one of those commercial companies taking advantage of research opportunities in low Earth orbit, in microgravity on board the International Space Station. A number of CubeSats with a number of functions going to be deployed, among them 8 Lemur 2 CubeSats, going to be adding to a constellation managed by a company known as Spire that does global ship, weather, and aviation tracking. For the ship, you can kind of think of it as air traffic control for boats moving across the Earth's oceans. With a number of satellites already in orbit, this will add to that. Also 2 CubeSats that were funded through NASA's Small Spacecraft Technology Program, also known as SSTP. And that all focused on developing different technologies that are going to expand the capabilities of small spacecraft, which can be a lot easier to get into orbit and also a lot less expensive. And then these capabilities focusing on things like communication and propulsion and also autonomous operations. So a lot of science work still to be done for the OA-8, the Cygnus mission. The vehicle, which delivered over 7,400 pounds of research and supplies, a lot of that crew supplies and also spare hardware for the International Space Station. This an example of one of the CubeSats that it delivered. This was actually deployed from the International Space Station itself. And this investigation looking at microgravity's effect on the antibiotic resistance of E. coli, very common pathogen down here on Earth, and something to look out for. Microgravity shown to have a lot of different effects on not only the basic physics of living in space, but also having effects on things like the human immune system and also the virility of different pathogens. So this CubeSat was launched from the International Space Station, sent out into orbit, and this studying how microgravity is affecting that pathogen E. coli. And so it's been just about 20 minutes since Cygnus was released. So we should be hearing the call for exiting the approach ellipsoid momentarily. Meanwhile, if you're looking down at the Earth there, just to the right, you might see some land formations that are familiar. It's actually the space station just about to cross over the Mediterranean Sea. It's going to pass just under Italy. So right there, that's actually the island of Sicily, and then the iconic boot shape of the country of Italy coming into focus there on the left side of your screen. And again, we're just standing by for confirmation that Orbital has departed that approach ellipsoid. And just there, got the confirmation. Cygnus is out of the approach ellipsoid and has departed the area immediately around the International Space Station. So with that, the SS Gene Cernan Orbital ATK's 8th resupply mission, it's time.
On 2, Cygnus has exited the approach ellipsoid.
And there, real quick, the call from.
Copy, that is great news. Thank you.
The call from Capcom Kathy Bolt letting the crew know.
Enjoy your meal.
Nothing but the finest cuisine for today.
Sounds great.
But again, with that, Cygnus out of the area, on its way now towards the final stages of its 8th resupply mission. It's departed the International Space Station. It'll release some CubeSats, and then following that, it will set up for that destructive re-entry. The vehicle packed with over 6,200 pounds of trash and other items marked for disposal. It'll ultimately re-enter through the Earth's atmosphere, burning up upon that re-entry, and that targeted for December 18th. So just to recap, the vehicle was released successfully this morning at 7:11 a.m. Central Time, 8:11 a.m. Eastern, with NASA astronaut Mark Vande Prime at the robotics controls, backed up by Joe Acaba. The vehicle, which was unberthed yesterday for some engineering tests, had been docked to the International Space Station for 21 days. Its mission in its 24th day since launch back on November 12th. But everything went very smoothly this morning. The release just about on time. Cygnus out of the approach ellipsoid, going to deploy those CubeSats, and then eventually do that destructive re-entry. So I want to thank you for waking up this morning, following along as we said farewell to the SS Gene Cernan, another successful mission for Orbital ATK and NASA's commercial resupply providers. And again, follow them online for more information, and as always, follow us on nasa.gov and across the various social media for the International Space Station. With that, though, we're going to go ahead and sign off. Thanks again for joining us, and this is Mission Control Houston.